Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going to be taking a look at Wretched Rose, and honestly, though this character has an insane amount of potential and it's only the first day, I did a pretty extensive amount of testing, and to give you a bit of context, I've spent basically the past, I don't know, 20 or so games running through and trying to see if this character could work. I've had some ups, I've had some downs with her. Truthfully, there are a couple combos that I can recommend and advise against, but a lot of the games had pretty clear indicators for why or when she would be strong. Without further ado though, let's actually break down everything you need to know when it comes to this character. Now, the first thing we should talk about is her skills. Now, if you aren't familiar with Wretched Rose, her skill 3 can be a little bit complicated. So before, or the first time that you use, or I should really say, when you don't have this unique effect that you have on screen right here, which is Solution, effectively what this character does is just cleanse and also provide a barrier. Now, this barrier is pretty fat, honestly. However, in terms of value, the dispel plus the barrier itself is what's valuable. And after the fact, of course, what you really want from this effect is just the solution so that you can then enhance your next skill 3. Now, solution enhances, or all that solution does is enhance the next once in a lifetime research. While this specific effect is not crazy, what you do after you have solution is what's so impactful. Now, once you have said buff, you grant time reversal to all allies except for the caster, and you also grant a barrier proportional to the caster's max HP to all allies except for the caster, again for 2 turns. Now, this specific line here is what's crazy. It reads that it returns to the state after the start of a battle, and it only applies in PvP. And before we go any further with the rest of her kit, I do want to say that this is probably the part of, I guess, Wretched Rose's kit that everyone thought would be super insane, and admittedly, it is kind of crazy. However, it is worth mentioning that, especially with the way that she works, it can sometimes feel, especially if you're playing slower, as if Wretched Rose doesn't cycle enough, such that you can actually make Solution work, or in some cases, the character that you're going to be buffing or the team that you're going to be reversing will not survive in time. And that actually leads me to my next very important topic or piece of information or detail about Wretched Rose, which is just the fact that unlike what I had originally believed, if any ally is dead at the time of the time reversal, they do not get brought back, they do not get reset, and with this is obviously a huge L. Now, I should also mention, of course, that there are certain characters that will receive their buffs back, or they will receive their skills back, and as you probably saw from a few of my initial attempts, I was trying to pair this character a lot with a character like Roz, and truthfully, this was not as insane as you think it would be. There was a lot of struggling trying to make this character work, and admittedly, I kind of just kept getting kicked in the head by Hua Young, so it didn't really end up feeling worth it. Now, back to her skills though. Her skill 2 is a increased critical hit resistance to all allies for 2 turns. And maybe if I were playing a bit slower with Wretched Rose, this would be more impactful, but this is effectively a 50-50, kind of similar to as if the entire enemy team was blinded, except you still take the damage, honestly. And some of the characters that are one-shotting you can sometimes either, number 1, just outright crit you through this, kill you without a crit, or 3, don't even need to touch you when you die anyways. So with this, Aegis of Time, a cool passive, but what I would say is probably the most important or relevant detail about this skill 2 is that you can revive with 50% health once you have this maxed. Now, this is going to be extremely helpful, especially as you kind of need to just stall over and over. And as I'm sure you're probably seeing across the space right now, there are a lot of people that are trying to stall in some way, shape, or form to make Wretched Rose work. And the honest truth is that if you wanted to stall out or kind of like rope people, hostage people into like a very long Soul Weaver healing sort of situation, that's exactly what you could do. And it's quite toxic. Now, that said, we should also talk about her skill 1, because this is also pretty impactful when it comes to her abilities. Now, admittedly, though, this character would probably be even more crazy if I'm about to suggest, or if they would make the change I'm about to suggest. But admittedly, her Wretched Rose's skill 1 actually doesn't synergize as comfortably or as easily as you might imagine with Wretched Rose. Now, the reason for this is that although you use your skill 3 and you have to use your skill 3 in order to get your solution, you have a full turn effectively where you aren't, protected or hidden with this skill 1. Now, this is partially, or I should say part of the reason why it does feel like if you run counter set on her, you may be able to find some value in this skill 1 constantly reapplying stealth to you. However, with the build that we'll get to in a moment, I actually found that in order for you to actually be able to get solution off more reliably, more efficiently, and you could actually, well, revive a team without everyone on your team being dead, it felt like you actually had to play pretty fast on Wretched Rose. And of course, this isn't doable, or you don't have the ability to take an extra turn, which is kind of like what is missing in her kit if you really wanted to design an absolutely bonkers, disgustingly broken 4-star soul weaving or 4-star light character, similar to the old Angel of Lights level kind of character. Now, in terms of this, that is still a good thing, and to be fair, this is a character that does have a soul burn, and you can soul burn this to grant yourself an extra turn. However, in terms of what this character feels really good at, it is just stalling, cleansing, giving yourself a bit of heal, a barrier, and then resetting the entire enemy team, and hopefully your team can one-shot or deal with the enemy team before they all die. However, again, admittedly, this has definitely not been the case in a number of situations where it has felt like the team just disappears, dies, or I have Wretched Rose and no one focuses her, but then I have no team left anyways. Now, we should actually talk now about builds, as again, this is pretty relevant for her. Now, I've gone through a couple iterations of builds. One of the most prominent ones that I'll actually bring up right now is, well, if you're curious about whether or not you could do something like use the revival set on your Rose, you should know that it was tried and I really did give it a swing. Yes, it's not the most pretty or the most insane looking build, but as you'd imagine, I kind of thought that you could get away with running something slow, be pretty tanky, just get into stealth and do away with all the nonsense. But the issue with that, and as you're probably going to experience if you try playing Wretched Rose yourself, is that, again, this is too slow and they just don't even kill your Rose. And even if they do, this 50% combat readiness push is maybe not necessarily enough if you're taking turns so slow at 200 speed. Now, if you are, or personally, if I were able to run something like a 250 or 260 Wretched Rose on this reversal set, I'd probably run it. However, admittedly, I obviously would probably subtract 20 or 30 speed, and I've also definitely seen people run Wretched Roses at the 270 range. But in case you're curious about the build, and of course in terms of the gear quality, this is not an easy character to build, or to build rather. Let me explain. So you're probably seeing these stat lines and you might be thinking to yourself that like 260, 270 is not necessarily the most insane stat line whatsoever. And you're right, because nowadays characters on average, if they're like speed DPS built, are in the 240 to 250 range. And don't even talk about like the actual speed characters in this game. The speed characters in this game are running at like the 300 to like 300 and so range. And that's for someone obviously that is not necessarily even chasing for so long or chasing gear so much anyways nowadays, but has obviously spent a decent amount of time chasing. That said, the gear quality that you need in order to be even at the 260 range is pretty astounding. In case you didn't catch this either, this is a 102 base speed character, or 103, I believe 102. But if you take a look at the pieces that I have here, of course, not necessarily perfect, and I have some wasted effectiveness. This is 18, 22, 18, 17, 16, and I'm only 260. Now, originally my goal was to be in the 280 or so range so I could consistently cycle, but just as a solid side note, if I were to put all of my fastest gear, which again equates to something like a 317 a 317 Litica, I only end up having something like a 291 Wretched Rose, which is ridiculous because this is the equivalent to a 324 Ran. Now, that said, or speed build aside, and I guess stat disclaimer aside, there are of course a couple builds that you could run with this Wretched Rose, especially if you want to be slower or tankier. However, I do kind of feel that in a lot of cases, the reset or the time reversal that people are fixating on is a bit more skewed or more beneficial if you're trying to play faster. Now, some of the other characters that you might be pairing with the Wretched Rose might be someone like Astrays. It could be someone like a Spirit Eye Celine, it could be a Kise, it could be any character you can think of, and these characters will be able to be barriered, protected, or saved a bit by the Wretched Rose. However, if you were to say reset a Crow, yeah, you have the whole, I guess, like your health, or you could go back and revive if you haven't already, or rather, I should say, you can use your horse and stuff, which can be somewhat nicer in certain cases. But in terms of the immediate impact, if these characters are going to die in some way, shape, or form, the Wretched Rose kind of, I don't want to say falls off, but number one, feels a little bit weird, just because, again, you're reviving a character who might not have done anything yet to begin with. Like, some characters really need to be a bit weathered, or they need very specific scenarios or very specific situations in order to use their abilities, and they just haven't done that yet. And again, Wretched Rose is not really a character that you can wait on, because, again, you are always threatened either by killing the Wretched Rose, and obviously Rose doesn't do anything after the fact, or you have to deal with the fact that, like, some of your allies will also die while you're waiting for all of them to perfectly use their abilities. Now, that basically means that in terms of build, yes, you may be able to run something like counter, you may be able to run something like reversal. I just want to caution you though, however, because from my testing and from what you probably saw in terms of my RTA arena setup, this was basically the majority of all these reds here. Trying to use her on, oh, sorry, not this one. Trying to use her, oh, not this one either. Oops. There we go. Trying to use her alongside Genesis Ross at this slower rate was not that effective. I did try picking her earlier on because I was trying to, formulate and figure out like a rotation. And admittedly, yes, like some of my characters were a bit squishier, but even in certain lineups where I had, things like a Lidica for the skill nulls, I had the Arunca for barriering, and I even had Genesis Roz. All these characters are not necessarily super tanky. I would still kind of get outpaced or one shot, or I would start dealing or start getting punished really hard by counterattacks, or the Renak, who's able to, kind of tempo up and kind of one-shot me. And it really wasn't until I swapped to more of a speed build, and this one doesn't really count either because I just one-shot the entire team. But like, it really wasn't until I started mixing and matching a little bit with the build. Like, I started using the Spirit Eye Celine, I started adding a bit more survivability. I wasn't just trying to use Roz, but instead I was able to either revive the Rose, or I was able to add another layer of security and also be fast in order for this character to feel, well, in all honesty, just a bit quicker and a bit more impactful in terms of what she does. Now, that leads us now to her artifact, and this is actually the artifact that I felt the most comfortable on. Now, of course, you could obviously use the more appropriate limited artifact, which is Guardian Ice Crystal in this case, but I actually feel like being able to stall and heal is what felt way better than basically anything else. In some cases, I could probably imagine using something like spotted mouse hair tie, or even something like bird's eye view, if you really wanted to just generate souls and be able to soul burn, and I think that'll probably be an angle. But in terms of surviving long enough so that you can actually use several turns worth of S1s, or be able to get your second S3, I think you're probably better off using something that keeps you a bit more safe or a bit healthier, or heals. Otherwise, again, I think souls obviously always going to be valuable or be helpful, of course, unless if you end up fighting against Bellion. Now, that was a mouthful. Let's actually talk about some of the team lineups that you can expect, though, when it comes to Wretched Rose. Now, again, from what I saw, there is a variety of ways that you could play this. Personally, I didn't actually end up fighting against a whole ton of Wretched Rose specifically, and that's probably because, again, she is probably more of the faster, aggressive archetype as opposed to being more slow, at least from the initial days of testing. But with this, I think some of the best more common pairings that you would use with the Wretched Rose include, again, characters like Hua Young, where if you kill someone on your team, well, then Wretched Rose, either Wretched Rose gets punished, but then you get rewarded with Hua Young, because if you lower one character too low, then you're able to one-shot them, or you're able to, in some cases, like, you're not going to be able to kill anyone, and then Wretched Rose can reset, and then you have like the Hua S3 or two S3s. And alongside this, I actually found that basically anyone that had any sort of survivability, whether that's ML Celine, whether that's even Shaltir, definitely felt way more usable or effective in this case, and especially for this fight specifically, where there was a lot of evasion and a lot of reviving going on. It felt like the Rose had pretty good value. This was a bit weirder of a match, of course, because, well, he banned it, and I actually do think that Rose would have been pretty good here. There were very clear ways for me, especially in this match, to deal with all of the fire units and also debuff or stun the enemy team. But overall, I feel like in terms of what she might be best for, I think in some of these really fast matchups, you can definitely run her with souls in order to obviously just give yourself access to more souls. But in some cases, I can even imagine that if you end up getting outsped, like I believe I did in this last game, it's not the end of the world. I do have the Witch of the Mere Tenebria, and even though, if I'm not mistaken, the Luna actually ended up going first here, he was kind of at a loss for what to do, because, you know, if he ends up pressing buttons here, that's fine. I skip my turn, his entire team gets sealed and, you know, has to deal with all the recovery, and then I have a full cleanse, well, for everyone but Witch of the Mere Tenebria, or rather for everyone but Rose, coming up soon, and that's good enough for me. You know, I have a lot of tempo. Witch of the Mirror is not really letting anyone deal damage or really be able to use any of their abilities, gain buffs, etc. And ultimately, I was able to cleanse my Rose later with the Amid, and, well, you can kind of imagine how this ended up panning out, but it was a quite long game, and I was able to deal with a lot of these tankier characters because I had a complete reset and 2 Hwa-Young S3s, which, or technically 3, including her passive, which is absolutely ridiculous. Now, we should actually talk about whether or not this character can be used in PvE, and truthfully, I don't know how reasonable this character is, just because it already says here, as you've probably imagined, only applied in PvP as a pretty OP, or a pretty, I should say, a dead giveaway for the fact that this character pretty much can't be used in PvE. However, if you end up wanting to use this character in something like Guild War or even Arena, I think you might have to cook a little bit hard with her. Again, I found it pretty difficult in order to, or I found it pretty difficult to stall games out long enough in general. And in Guild War and Arena, notoriously and famously, these are kind of scenarios where you might get jump scared by something like a Spirit Eye artifact, or sorry, a secret art storm Celine, or some character that has that artifact. You may end up also dealing with the Spirit of Purification, a Bastion of Hope on a character, and a Moonlight Dreamblade of some sort, and you end up getting twisted, kind of bent out of shape with that, and that kind of punishes Wretched Rose significantly, as again, like if you aren't expecting some things to happen, Wretched Rose doesn't necessarily perform well, as again, if you're trying to take anyone but I guess an already high survivability character into a lineup with Wretched Rose, it doesn't feel good, of course, if they just die and then, well, you're just stuck with Wretched Rose and you have no way of reviving or bringing them back. That said, if you wanted to run something like Wretched Rose alongside perhaps like a Ruel and an ML Celine, that's fine. But again, that's kind of catering more towards the like hostage or super like really just rope sort of playstyle. And if that's the sort of thing that you're into or you're interested in, and maybe you end up using characters like the Dark Corvus, that could be cool. However, that is also an extremely tedious process. If you want to test it out for yourself, by all means feel free to, but that wasn't necessarily what I found to be either the most enjoyable or even necessarily the most successful. Now, I should also say, when it comes to my build specifically, I actually am very happy with the lineup that I have right now. Of course, I have a decent amount of effect resistance. I not only have about 200 just on base, I also have 15 from here. And with this, most characters that tried to debuff my Rose were ineffective or were unable to. The speed also helped, as obviously I'm trying to play quite fast. I am taking her in most cases alongside someone like Lady of the Scales, and honestly, if you put Lady of the Scales alongside Wretched Rose, this feels like absolutely bonkers unlosable, or an unlosable basically sort of situation. Of course, you do have to deal with or watch out for characters like the Veronica, but honestly, even with the Veronica, like, you know, unless you're fighting against something like an Arunca, you can either kill the entire Veronica's team in some cases, or you can just kill her if she's not on guiding light, or depending on what she's using. But honestly, speed on Wretched Rose does not feel bad whatsoever. I may end up experimenting again with souls at some point, as I am playing her super fast, but more than anything else, I do think that this reset, assuming that all of my allies are able to be, I don't know, like Stray's invulnerability, or they're able to have invincibility, or rather immortality through Spirit Iceline, with all these sort of survivability strats, or even including someone like ML Hua, it doesn't necessarily feel like they're at danger or at risk of play, or rather at risk of dying. And with that, I actually find the faster build for Rose to be quite effective, though again, I may be able to see some some scenarios or situations where running her slow will work too, though again, I definitely think you have to be very careful in who you select for that team comp. Now, obviously, I've talked a bit about this, but to kind of just run down pros and cons of this character real quick. Number one, you have to pull her from a Mystic Banner, where you'd either have to get unlucky on your pulls, or you'd have to pull for the ML4s, which I think is kind of an L. Otherwise, you can always try and wait and get her from something random. But in terms of, honestly, she herself, I think her design looks pretty cool. I think the concept of her kit is extremely unique, like something we haven't seen in quite a while. I think in terms of the cleanse, obviously having a team-wide full cleanse is quite impactful. And I also think the barrier is not insignificant. It's actually decent, especially if you're trying to avoid some chip damage. Now, to add to this, I do think the fact that she has a revive on S2, the critical hit chance in some, or critical hit resistance in some cases, and also the stealth on S1 does make her a bit more annoying to knock out of stealth, or to kind of deal with in some cases. However, these are obviously pros that are associated alongside cons. Like, to begin with, this is not a very easy to gear character, even if I say that I like her at this 260 speed. In terms of artifacts, you may need, or you may end up wanting something either like the Guardian Ice Crystal to heal yourself, but this of course is technically a quote-unquote limited artifact. And just in case you're curious, Bird's Eye View is also an artifact that you do need to kind of tune out, or you have to, I believe, get at least 24 souls. I'm not exactly sure if you'd be able to do it with Wretched Rose. I think it's 3 souls, so actually I think it's fine here, but you have to kind of at least have a certain number of copies of Bird's Eye View if you wanted to get souls with this, which again is part of the reason why it feels a little bit weird for Wretched Rose in order to be able to like more effectively deal with souls in general. That said, though, I think also in general, you know, though it is nice to have things like the revive, it also does make you obviously prone to getting kicked by a Hua, and you are of course a light character. And to add to this, the critical hit resistance, as I mentioned earlier, is not the infallible shield that you think it is. Finally, in terms of the stealth, I do think it's nice, of course, to have this, but when you're playing Wretched Rose, most of the time you're going to S3 first and have that full turn where people can just kick or deal with you or try to one-shot you. And if you're not careful, or if you're trying to play her with a certain amount of ER or speed, you're actually quite prone to getting one shot or dealt with or provoked or any of these things in between, maybe even one shot by a straight AoE while you're trying to prevent, or while you're trying to get into this stealth sort of mode. Finally, in terms of, I guess, maybe her most major con, I don't necessarily know how easy of a character it is, or easy of a character Wretched Rose is to pilot. I'm sure there's going to be a team comp that you'll see on the ladder where someone uses someone like Light Acades or a Ruel or a Destina or some sort of reviver alongside Spirit Iceline in order to make this character work. But ultimately, I by no means think this is like a one press or like a one press character. It's by no means as easy as the buff that Smilegate gave to Amid, and this is definitely no Lady of the Scales Mercedes in terms of how ridiculous or how annoying it is to play this character. Now, I will say, of course, that probably my overall or my final summarizing thoughts about Wretched Rose is that while she might not be the most OP character, I think she has extremely strong synergies, especially if people get stolen away from you or if people draft very differently. And with that, I think that's probably her greatest strength, which is that, again, maybe on the 2, 4, or 5 slot in draft, you may be able to pair this with her. And otherwise, if you just have to use this alongside a Ruel or a Destina, or find a pocket pick or a pocket situation where this character is strong, I don't think it's that big a deal, and I don't think you end up losing too much from that. Anyways, guys, that's going to be it for today's video. I think Wretched Rose is pretty interesting. I've spent my head kind of slamming, or I've spent like the past 2 hours basically slamming my head into RTA to try and get this character to work a little bit, and that's what I found. These are my day 1 impressions, of course, of the character though, so feel free to let me know what you think, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good luck with your polls.